All right, class. Today I want to talk a bit about Alfred B. Xuma. This book that I assigned you, the biography of Alfred B. Xuma, um, because he's a really important figure in South African history. And also, he was active during a really significant period in South African history. Now, Alfred Xuma was born in the Eastern Cape in 1893. Now, this is very significant because this meant that as a little boy, he was a little boy between the ages of 5 and 8 when the South African War was being fought. Now, the South African War, in some books, in a lot of older books, is called the Boer War. I mean, that was a British term because it referred to fighting against Afrikaners, who at that time the British called Boers, which is the Dutch word for farmer. Now, the Boer War, the South African War, I just got done using that term myself. The South African War is very significant because what it meant was that after that war, you have negotiations for a couple of years, and then you end up by 1910 with the Union of South Africa. South Africa becomes essentially an independent dominion within the British Empire. Now, this meant that all of South Africa was under the control of the British, and it meant that the Afrikaners understood that the Afrikaners understood that there basically wasn't any escaping from the British Empire. They were going to be part of the British Empire, and really their strategy changes. Eventually, instead of trying to break away from the British Empire, they realize that among white people they're the majority, and they start really working to get political power within the framework of the South African government. Now, as far as the black majority is concerned, the period at the end of the 19th century going into 20th century is significant because you basically no longer have independent black political units within the country of South Africa. Really, the last attempt at any kind of rebellion was the rebellion of the Zulu leader Bambatha in 1907. He was defeated pretty badly. They chopped his head off, and from that point forward, Africans understood that they were within the Union of South Africa, and that really goes back to the previous book we read by Saul Plaatje. Saul Plitty. I got to get used to saying that the Dutch way and stop trying to anglicize his name. But the book by Saul Plitty, Native Life in South Africa, where he is writing saying that, look, you all, the British people should see to it that we're treated fairly. Now, Alfred B. Xuma represents the next generation of leadership after Plitty. And Alfred B. Xuma is really significant because he is an African who really embraces Western education. And frankly, he gets a better education than most South Africans, white or black, at this time. Because he eventually leaves South Africa as a young man. He goes to school at Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. And then he goes up north to University of Minnesota. He goes to a number of places. He becomes a medical doctor. Then he comes back home to pursue his career as a medical doctor, and eventually he becomes president of the ANC, or African National Congress, which to this day is still the biggest political party in South Africa, although they just yesterday had a really bad election defeat. But that's getting ahead of us. Now, the significant thing about Alfred B. Xuma is that his prime is during what's known as the segregation era of South Africa. Now, for those of y'all who are in my class, I asked you all to read all the way through chapter 5 in this book, Leonard Thompson's History of South Africa. And that will cover the segregation era. Now, this is very significant because, for people my age who grew up at the time when there was active fighting against apartheid, if you didn't know South Africa, South African history, you would think that all the troubles in South Africa came about after 1948 and apartheid. But to be honest with you, things like the pass system, segregation of everything, that happened, a generation or two before apartheid. That was during the segregation era, and all these segregation policies were actually first promulgated by the British. Alfred B. Xuma came up during this time. Now, as I mentioned before, Alfred Xuma was born on the Eastern Cape of South Africa. Now, this area was very significant because it was an area where you had a large number of black landowners. If you look in your book, for instance, before you get to the actual book itself, in the Roman numeral section, section 14 Roman numerals, you have a map right here, and it shows the map of in the Eastern Cape where he grew up. Like I said, that was an area where you had a very, very low white population. Blacks outnumbered whites about 14-1. You had a very high percentage of black landowners. As a matter of fact, this was an area where you had a significant number of black people who qualified to vote under the old laws that had been written, in Cape Town back in the 1830s that allowed for people of color to vote, if they met certain property qualifications. Now, also, this area too is where South Africa's oldest HBCU, or historically black college university, Fort Hare University, was established. And so because of this, a really big proportion of South Africa's political leadership came from this part of the Eastern Cape, including Nelson Mandela. Now, not all the leadership came there. People came from other parts, but a really big percentage of South Africa's leadership came from this area. And what it also meant too is that a really large percentage of South Africa's political leadership came from the Xhosa community. And, in later years, there would be some people who would make a fuss about that, saying, Xhosa control everything. And really, since independence, all of South Africa's presidents, except for President Xuma, who was Zulu, who is Zulu, he's still among us, came from Xhosa background. But anyway, one of the interesting things about this period in South African history is that the British, who were controlling the country, really looked to the United States as a model on how to manage black people. Because, of course, the United States had gone through a civil war, slavery had ended, black people were no longer slaves, but at the same time, black people did not have social equality. And so the British looked towards the United States, for instance, on things like how to write segregation laws. They looked at models of laws. They would go to the Library of Congress and look at segregation laws in various states and see how to write them. They also looked at black institutions of education. Fort Hare very much was modeled on places like, I can't remember the name of the school in Virginia. It's actually, Hampton University. I had a senior moment there for a minute. And they also looked at Tuskegee. Now, one of the interesting things that the author of the Xuma biography, Professor Gish, one of the things he notes is that, really going back to the 19th century, there had been a tradition of Africans who went to the United States in order to gain an education. They went to black institutions or other schools. And so Xuma very much was in that tradition. He went to Tuskegee, and this is very significant. He went to Tuskegee just a little bit before Booker T. Washington passed on. And, he came to the United States really at the worst point in American history for African Americans. The 19 teens when it came, this was the period when you had lynchings at the highest level. And so really, he actually went to a more dangerous place than where he grew up in. Because where he grew up in South Africa, South Africa had gone through war. South Africa was segregated. Black South Africans had very limited political power. But you never have a lynch culture in South Africa. You never have a culture of where, a black person insults somebody or is accused of a crime and mobs, come up and hang the person. That was never part of South African culture. So in terms of personal danger, Alfred B. Kuma actually went to a more dangerous environment when he went to Alabama than where he was when he was in South Africa. But still, this was an opportunity for him to get an education. At that time, really, Tuskegee wasn't really a university when he went there. It was really more of an advanced uh, technical high school. And so he studied agriculture and other things. And then he went, to Minnesota, went to Northwestern, went to a number of places in order to attain his goal of becoming a physician. And actually, he also worked as an intern in St. Louis at Homer G. Phillips, which is the black hospital that used to exist in St. Louis until about 1979, 1978, I think. Um, and so Alfred B. Kuma actually has a direct tie to where we are here in the greater St. Louis area. Now, after all of that education, Kuma returns to South Africa. Um, Let me look in the book. Let me get the exact date here. Yeah, come on. Let's see. It's taking a long. Here we go. Yeah, he returns home in 1927. And frankly, the South African authorities are kind of freaking out over him because they're like, some of them didn't even want to believe he was actually a South African. They thought he might be an African American, pretending he was a South African, trying to get over to the South Africa for whatever reason. They freaked out about him because, one of the really weird things about South Africa that starts under segregation, during the segregation period, and it gets even worse during apartheid, is that, with European takeover of South Africa, with the establishment of mining and industry, the traditional economic and political systems of Africans had been destroyed. And Africans really, early on, realized that things were changing and were more than willing to adjust to the new economic reality. I mean, Africans would get jobs in mining and other things. They would save their money, go back home, buy livestock, get married. They were perfectly willing to work in the modern economy because they saw where it could benefit them personally. Now, the problem with this, however, is that white authorities, the Afrikaners and the British, and primarily the British during the segregation era, they feared Africans getting educations. They feared Africans getting professional training because, first of all, they realized that even though this was the period when the white population in South Africa was at its highest, about 1 out of 5 people in South Africa, during the early part of the 20th century, was white. Even though this is when white population was the highest, 20% is still a pretty small minority. They knew that they were always outnumbered, and working class whites in particular feared competition from black labor. And also there was always a fear that, Africans would get back into political power. And so an educated person like Kuma really posed a significant dilemma for colonial authorities. When he first comes home, they want to limit, his practice, say, oh, under no circumstances, touch a white patient, especially a white woman. Kind of the same talk that one would have heard in the United States. But in South Africa, the stakes were higher from the white perspective because blacks were an absolute majority in that country. Now, Kuma, interestingly enough, was not a guy who was particularly interested in being overtly political. He was a physician, he had worked hard. And really, you have to understand the political culture of South African leadership. Now, if you all remember the previous book I had you all read, Native Life in South Africa, the whole purpose of that book by Saul Plitty was to appeal for intervention on the part of the British on behalf of South Africans, black South Africans. And so black South Africans realized that in the previous century, with the exception of the Battle of Isandlwana or the success of Moshweshwe, in Lesotho, which technically is not South Africa, but it's completely surrounded by South Africa. And except for Sandawana and Mshweshwe being able to defeat the Afrikaners, because he had gotten access to horses and guns, uh, blacks really had not done well militarily against whites. And so, as I said before, the last even minor attempt at rebellion was 1907 with Bambatha. And the great majority of Africans realized that, a military conflict was not going to serve them well. And so the tactics of the African National Congress at this time was to petition the government and ask for redress. Now, ultimately, this becomes futile because it becomes obvious that, they could, no, I don't care how well they wrote, I don't care how well they explained themselves, I don't care how educated and how articulate, which is, that's always a loaded word for black folks because it seems to suggest that it's something unusual that black folks could speak. And especially in South Africa, where most black folks, even if folks can't read their name, speak 10 languages. I mean, that's not an exaggeration. I mean, it's very typical for black South Africans, especially in the cities, to be fluent in 10 languages. And so it should never be a surprise when black South Africans, speak well. I mean, that's just a survival thing to be able to do that. But anyway, to get back on point, their strategy had been to petition the government for redress. And this pretty much was something that Xuma was, he had accepted that was the reality and he was prepared to do that. Now, what happens is that because he is such an educated man, because he's a physician, which means that he's independent. He's not like a teacher or somebody who has to work for the government. He's in a position to lead without being pressured by the government in a way that most black South Africans are not. And so it's not surprising that eventually he becomes leader of the ANC. And once he becomes leader of the ANC, he's a very thorough, very professional man. He does a really good job of getting the ANC in order fiscally. He saves money. Like, for instance, if you go to Chapter 5, he's president of the ANC from 1941 to 1949. He basically puts the organization on firm footing. Now, the interesting thing, however, is that, the period from 1941 to 1949, most of that period, for Britain, World War II starts in 1939, but, for that period from 41 to 45, Britain is in World War II. And this is an interesting period because, there are a percentage of Afrikaners who support the Nazis because they still can't stand the British. I mean, they were beaten very bad in the South African War, and that was a very bitter thing for them. And so you have a certain percentage of Afrikaners who support the Nazis, although that really doesn't amount to much because they're really not in a position to go against the British government. But more importantly, what it means is that because a large number of white men are in the war effort, this means that the South African economy becomes more dependent than ever on black labor. And, this goes back to something that the British had developed. They first started developing this in Durban on the east coast of South Africa. The pass system, what they refer to as influx control, controlling the amount of Africans who come into the city. But this becomes a national problem. Pretoria, Johannesburg, Cape Town, everywhere in South Africa, more and more Africans are needed. And so, although the country is determined not to give Africans rights, it becomes ever more dependent on black labor, and quite often skilled black labor in order to survive. And this happens during the period of Xuma. Now, what we see is that after the war is over, you have the rise of the National Party in South Africa. This is an Afrikaner-based party. They eventually win the election in 1948. And then this is when they established apartheid government. Now we're going to go into apartheid in more detail later, but the basic idea of apartheid was kind of segregation on steroids. I mean, because basically they argued that South Africa was a number of individual nations, and that each nation should have its own destiny. Now, in practical terms, what this meant was that all whites were put into one group. British and Afrikaners, even though the Afrikaners, hated the heck out of the British, and the British weren't all that keen on the Afrikaners. Both of them were willing to get together as two white communities in order to see to it that they were able to maintain control of South Africa. Now, on the flip side, for black South Africans, you had a situation where people were constantly moving into cities. Like, for instance, Dr. Platy, not Dr. Platy, but Dr. Xuma, he lived in a part of Johannesburg known as Sophia Town. And Sophia Town, was a really exciting, to kind of use the old lingo, it was really a jumping place. Sophia Town was a place where you had a large African community, you had Chinese immigrants there, you had a significant mixed race or colored community. It was a place, like you had a lot of black musicians there. Like jazz was really big in South Africa at this time. Jazz is still really huge in South Africa. You had a lot, and it was kind of a mixture a lot of times of African American music and African music. You had African jazz, and then you also had a lot of South African groups that sounded like the African American vocal groups that got big in the 1940s. Sophia Town was also a place where people like Dr. Xuma could have their businesses and could own property. People own property there. Now, once the Nationalist Party comes into power, their basic goal is to try to force as many Africans as possible back to their so-called homelands. Places that many of them have been put out of a generation or two earlier. And also, what's very significant too is that the National Party wanted to hold on to Southwest Africa territory that South Africa had gotten control of during World War I, that had been German territory. And so they had gone before the United Nations to try to get this territory. Now, the thing that's significant about this is that the person who kind of led this effort, and this was a little bit before apartheid, but was General Jan Smuts. Smuts had, he was not an apartheid guy, but he was an Afrikaner. He was a guy who saw himself as a pragmatist. He realized the British had won back with the South African War, and that South Africa was part of the British Empire, so they might have to try to work through that framework. But they wanted to maintain control of Southwest Africa, and have Southwest Africa, what is nowadays Namibia, as a UN-sanctioned mandate. And really, this becomes Dr. Xuma's biggest moment, because Dr. Xuma goes to New York. He goes to the new United Nations, and he lays out the case of racial discrimination carried on by the South African government, and says no, Namibia should not be run by the South African government because it will discriminate against the majority population. And so because of this, South Africa is denied a recognition of control of Namibia. Now, they fight and try to hold on to it anyway. But this is really key in undermining the legitimacy of the South African government. And really, it's one of the first times, basically, Dr. Xuma is able to do what Saul Plitty was unable to do a generation earlier. He's able to go before an international body, and he's able to get that body to acknowledge the discriminatory tendencies of South Africa. Now, that's because a generation later, instead of a League of Nations, you have the United Nations. And even at this early stage in the 1940s, you have countries like Egypt, Indonesia, India, uh, countries that had been colonized and that were not perceived as white, who were sympathetic to them. And so he was able to achieve a significant political victory against the South African government. And so, really, he's a significant political transitional figure because he's the guy who really gives up on petitioning the government. Just basically being a loyal citizen and asking for legal redress. He realizes that these people are not going to do right, and we cannot achieve anything simply by asking them to be nice to us because they're not going to do it. And so, from that standpoint, Dr. Xuma really becomes a example of what an outspoken and aggressively activist Black South African political movement can do. And he literally paves the way for Mandela because at the time Xuma is the leader. Mandela is a young man who becomes involved in the African National Congress Youth League, and eventually those people will be the ones who eventually end up replacing Dr. Xuma. Now, I hope this lecture was interesting or helpful to you. Now, there's some other things I could have talked about too. Like one thing I always find interesting about Dr. Xuma is that he never married a South African woman. His first wife was a Liberian. I believe she was an American Liberian. That is a Liberian of African American descent. And his second wife was an African American woman from North Carolina. I think that that's kind of an example of how much he really kind of absorbed African American culture. The fact that he never married a woman from his own country. His wives were women who either were from America or from countries that were culturally very influenced by America. I always find that interesting about him. Well, anyway, I hope this lecture is useful to you, and good reading.